Hey, Neyooxet. So my name is Neyooxet Greymorning. But one of the things that I realized, and it applies to language learning, and I mean to what's going on in the world of language revitalization. You can go out to try to save someone who's drowning, and if you don't know what you're doing, they will drown you. In fighting for their last breath, they will drown you. So you have to know how to navigate through that. But the other thing, which this applies in a different way, the other thing that is also true is a person will drown and fight for their life, but they will always give up in the end. They'll tire out and they'll give up. And that's what's happening in the States. They're giving up. And most of them have given up. In my own language community, when I entered college, there were probably about 2,000 speakers. We're down to 50. There's some communities that are working Ojibwe. They're doing some great stuff. Navajo has 100,000 speakers, more or less. And there's a few pockets, but that's maybe 3% of the native population down there on reservations. So it doesn't look good. When it comes to adults, it's important to realize that adults have this capacity to almost always overthink stuff. And so you will get people thinking along lines and tangents that will just surprise me what's going on in their heads. You don't tend to find that as much with children. In teaching adults language, that is always something I have to be aware of, and how to refine that. And over the years, I've gotten better and better at doing that because I understand it a little better. And where I don't use literacy at all in the classroom, I don't have textbooks. I purposefully teach the class so that it only happens twice a week, because most people's learning environment outside in the community, they have a limited amount of time that they can use to teach language. So I purposely chose to do that, to try to mirror what happens outside of a structured classroom situation where you have minimal amount of time, to show that it's possible. And in a sense, I have structured chaos. So when you look at what I do, in the first 3 minutes, there's absolute structure. But after that, then that structure, the chaos, then it moves more chaotically, but it's structured chaos. And so the language is always building off of what preceded it, until I get to a point where I've discovered, I can say things that they've never heard before that are extremely complicated. And if I put down just enough of a foundation, they will understand what I'm saying. But even students will recognize that. They'll say things like, we learned something, but we don't actually know how we learned it. And I find that interesting because I'll smile and go, well, I know how you learned it. I never tell them that, but yeah, it was done deliberately. But it seems like there's no effort on their part, and they're absorbing this enormous amount of language that they themselves don't even realize until I start drawing it out. And I don't actually teach them how to speak the language. And then all of a sudden they're speaking the language. I teach them how to understand the language. And in doing that, I weave in the speaking part and they come out speaking the language. The method, accelerated second language acquisition, it mirrors how people learn their first language. And the way I explain it is, when a mother and father vie to get a child to say their first words of mama or dada, and they're doing that, what makes the child say one of those things? And that's the first time I actually asked that question. Usually I just give the answer. But the question is, what makes the child say that first word, mama, dada? Is it because they heard daddy saying it more or mama saying it more? Well, that's not, it's chance really. But what happens is there are pathways that are created that happen in the brain. Yeah, and this is where people get the idea repetition is important. Well, it's not really. But in this first instance, there's an association that happens. They know scientifically that a child will fixate on a face more than anything else. So they see this face in front of them, and it's going, say mama, say dad, dad, and it happens all the time. And it creates a pathway to the brain. And then what happens is the infant starts anticipating that sound, but they haven't produced it yet because anatomically they're not at that point. And then they get to a point where the parent comes in and they've anticipated it to the point where then they produce something. But they have no idea what that word means. The only connection there that exists is a direct association with the face and the sound. And basically, that's what I do. I create a direct association with the language and what is in front of them. And I create a world, I create an environment in which I can teach them an enormous amount of complexity in minutes.